As far as Mr. Epstein is concerned, it was the wrong decision to go and see him in 2010. As far as my association with him was concerned, it had some seriously beneficial outcomes in areas that have nothing to do with what I would describe as what we're talking about today. On balance, could I have avoided ever meeting him? Probably not, and that's because of my friendship with Zelin. It was inevitable that we would have come across each other. Do I regret the fact that he has quite obviously conducted himself in a manner unbecoming? Yes.
Unbecoming? He was a sex offender.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm being polite, in the sense that he was a sex offender.
As if that needs any introduction, that was, of course, Maitlis's interview with Prince Andrew back in 2019, the jaw-dropping interview. And ever since then, things have been going further downhill for Prince Andrew, culminating today in the decision that a case will go ahead against him.
It is quite a moment, actually, because that interview was more than 2 years ago. And along the way, the Duke of York has been fighting with his lawyers to make sure he never, ever has to face Virginia Giuffre in court. He never, ever has to be part of a deposition or a trial. But today, he lost that fight to stop a sex assault lawsuit being brought against him. And let us just bring you up to date then with the news that will have brought quite a low moment for many members of the royal family, because Prince Andrew had been hoping that a technicality would mean he would never actually have to face Virginia Giuffre. His lawyers had argued that this, at the time, young woman had signed away her right to sue the prince with a settlement that she agreed in 2009 with the financier, the paedophile Jeffrey Epstein, that could protect other defendants. But today, the judge, Lewis Kaplan, in New York, rejected all those arguments. We've been waiting for this judgment to drop for a week. And today, he said, this trial will go ahead.
And, of course, in some ways you'd say, well, is this a news story at all? Isn't it just one line, trial to go ahead as originally indicated? No, it is a huge story, both in Britain and in the United States. Because if there is one thing that the American audience is consistently interested in that happens on the other side of the Atlantic, it's not our politics, but anything to do with the royal family, is seized on and analysed in minute detail. And now you are going to have the potential situation, potential underlined, of Prince Andrew potentially taking the stand in a courtroom in New York accused of sexual assault. An extraordinary moment.
And I think, to put that in context, this is not just a royal story, although Sopes is right. Of course, anything royal, and it does include, weddings and jubilees and funerals and all the rest of it, always go down incredibly well with an American audience. But this is not really a royal story. It has royalty at the centre of it, yes, which is what makes it so sort of mind-blowing, really. But it's a story of a paedophile ring, and it's a story of trafficking, and it's a story of young women who were too young to even understand fully at the time what was happening to them and around them, and who have been given this chance to fight the case again in a civil lawsuit. Virginia Giuffre has brought this as a civil lawsuit because of the way the law has changed to allow her that window to say, please don't tell me this is too late. I was trafficked. I was 17, and I want to have the chance to put these allegations to the men I believe I have to accuse of paedophilia.
Serge, let's bring you in at this point, because I think it'd be worth just setting out how we've got to this point.
Well, this all began with Jeffrey Epstein being arrested on pedophilia charges, being charged with being a sex trafficker, being detained in prison in New York City awaiting trial. Obviously, there's a lot of media coverage of that, of agreements that he had made to avoid prosecution earlier about his relationships with famous and powerful people. And then it was supercharged when Jeffrey Epstein, before his trial, committed suicide. That kind of threw everything up into doubt about whether there'd be any kind of accounting, any kind of reckoning for his crimes. That led to the recent trial of his colleague, associate, girlfriend, whatever, Ghislaine Maxwell, who was found guilty just a few weeks ago of sex trafficking in relation to Jeffrey Epstein's crimes and his activities. And that also brought highlights onto one of those wealthy and powerful connections, which was Prince Andrew and the resulting civil lawsuit that has been taking place against him, which just had a big development in the past day.
So that's why this is a big deal. Epstein is dead. Ghislaine Maxwell, as of 1 month, not even a month, is now a convicted trafficker, also behind bars. And Prince Andrew has said repeatedly that he's friends with them. When I was talking to him in that interview, what was clear was that he found Jeffrey Epstein useful and engaging, and he opened doors to him, and he showed him interesting people in kind of cultural milieu.
The opportunities that I had to go to Wall Street and other places to learn whilst I was there were absolutely vital.
And Ghislaine Maxwell was his good friend. He invited her into the heart of Buckingham Palace. He invited them both to his daughter's birthday parties. I mean, in brackets, not the one at Pizza Express.
Certainly I wasn't aware when the invitation was issued what was going on in the United States. And I wasn't aware until the media picked up on it, because he never said anything about it.
But he has been a friend to them both. And I think that's why this is a very, very complicated web we're looking at. And clearly, the judge today doesn't express any view as to the truth of Giuffre's allegations. We do not know the guilt or the innocence of Prince Andrew, but what we do know is that he is now going to be made to answer those questions. Now, Zurch, you've been telling us that this came about after the Ghislaine trial and conviction. I mean, curious if our listeners are wondering why Virginia Giuffre didn't give evidence in that trial. What's the answer?
And that's a very good question. Clearly, the prosecutors made a decision not to put Virginia Giuffre on the stand. And there could be any number of reasons, but one that could be cited by Prince Andrew's lawyers is that she could be an unreliable witness, that she might have said things or had conflicts in her story that they could exploit. That certainly is reason to think about what was the motivation behind the prosecutors in that case and why she didn't take the stand. Maybe they felt they had a solid enough case without her and didn't want to risk it.
Because there was one woman, Carolyn Andriano, who testified in the Ghislaine trial, and she claimed that Virginia Giuffre told her back in 2001, so more than 20 years ago, that she had slept with Prince Andrew. And I think she'd then given this interview to the Mail and said, I got to sleep with him, which kind of raised eyebrows at the time. Clearly, we don't know the context of that conversation. We don't know the veracity of exactly what the text said. But I guess that also could potentially throw Virginia Giuffre into a different light, according to how Prince Andrew's lawyers would like to see her.
But let us kind of go back, because Maitlis, you play a critical role in the antecedents of this, in that astonishing interview you did with Prince Andrew at Buckingham Palace, where we saw a man who seemed to give the impression that he thought he was doing very well, jolly well, in explaining his case and why he was innocent, and then seemed rather shocked when the world did not react in the way that he had perhaps anticipated. I mean, I suppose a starting point ought to be the extent to which he knew Virginia Roberts, which was something you put to him.
I have no recollection of ever meeting this lady. None whatsoever.
You don't And he has denied that many times. He has denied that he knew her. He denied very clearly that he had ever had contact with her, had ever had sex with her. She accused him of being kind of sweaty and disgusting in Tramp nightclub.
He is the most hideous dancer I've ever seen in my life. I mean, it was horrible, and this guy was sweating all over me. Like, his sweat was like, it was raining basically everywhere, and I was just like, what?
And I think some of our listeners will remember his response to that and why sort of mechanically he could not have been the person she accused of sweating beside him in the nightclub. Let's just have another listen to that.
There's a slight problem with the sweating because I have a peculiar medical condition, which is that I don't sweat, or I didn't sweat at the time, and that was yes, I didn't sweat at the time because I had suffered what I would describe as an overdose of adrenaline in the Falklands War when I was shot at. And I simply, it was almost impossible for me to sweat. And it's only because I have done a number of things in the recent past that I'm starting to be able to do that again. So I'm afraid to say that there's a medical condition that says that I didn't do it, so therefore.
Is it possible that you met... So that was, let's call it the no sweat defence. But there was another part of that interview which, and to be honest, I've gone back to the transcript because there is stuff there that I almost don't remember him saying, and I've had to sort of remind myself that these words came out. Because a little bit later in the interview I said, for the record, is there any way you could have had sex with that young woman or any young woman trafficked by Giuffre Epstein in any of his residences? And he says...
No. And without putting too fine a point on it, if you're a man, it is a positive act to have sex with somebody. You have to take some sort of positive action. And so therefore, if you try to forget, it's very difficult to try and forget positive action.
I remember him telling me that in the interview and just thinking, I don't know what to do with my face. I don't know where to look now. I don't know how to follow up because you're trying to explain the act of sex for a man. And I was actually sort of speechless because what was he trying to say? He was trying to say that he would have remembered having sex because he had to have initiated the sex, or he didn't find her attractive, or he had to have found her attractive in order to have sex, or I mean, it depends sort of really how biological you want to get in terms of how you interpret that answer. But there were extraordinary moments there in his denials, and clearly he had thought about this in many different ways, and whether it was the sweating or the act of sex or the fact that he thinks that the photo of them was doctored.
From the investigations that we've done, you can't prove whether or not that photograph is faked or not, because it is a photograph of a photograph of a photograph.
There are a number of different times he says in that interview, there is no way I met her or I could have done any of those things I'm accused of.
So let's now talk about the interview that you did with Prince Andrew, because actually Americast was just being set up. I was in London for a few days, and it was agreed that Maitlis and I would do a photo shoot at a kind of 1930s style cocktail bar, kind of with gin martinis in our hands.
Why
for a
did we
Radio
do?
Times
What was
thing.
that about?
And
what was that about the gin martini? Why did we?
I've no idea.
It was
I
meant to
can't
be very
remember.
glamorous, like everything to do with America is glamorous.
It was America
Yeah.
30s. It was the kind of,
post-prohibition.
it was the America. It was the Hemingway bar or whatever.
Right.
Exactly. and so we were due to meet. I had a plane to catch to go back to Washington. And Maitlis is late. Not just late, she's very late. And the reason I'm told is that she's got a meeting at Buckingham Palace. And I thought, oh God, I bet this is some pointless flunky. She's just schmoozing for no real reason. I bet nothing ever comes of this. And so I was kind of pretty sulky and surly when she eventually arrived for this photo shoot, which we did pretty quickly. And then she wouldn't say why, would you? You wouldn't tell me anything that was going on.
Do you know what? Honestly, I was mortified because I'm never late. I'm ridiculously punctual. I find it really kind of low grade to be late for people, and I get really indignant when people are late for me. And this time, as you say, it wasn't just like, oh, it might be 5 or it might be 7 minutes. It was like 40 minutes late, and I tore into that room. And obviously, I just saw you, with your martini glass and your chairs, and I was like, oh, Sopes must have a rider that every time he does a photo shoot, he gets a really lovely cocktail. So I was like, oh, he's probably fine. And then I felt that awful weight, because this wasn't after the interview, it was after the very first sort of initial chat, and I wanted to spill my guts and tell you everything, and then I thought, I can't, this is never going to happen. It's never actually going to happen. So I think it's better if I just don't say anything and we just carry on. But of course, you can't be late and then not say anything and not feel like a bit of a dick. So I did, and I'm sorry, I apologise for that, but that was what was going on.
So you get to the interview at Buckingham Palace, and that must have been, wow, this is really happening. This is for real. He's going to sit down opposite me. I'm going to ask these questions. How rehearsed do you think he was? Had he been schooled? There was so much about it that would be deconstructed for years to come, because it was the seminal interview, and which you did brilliantly, where you just couldn't believe what was coming out of his mouth, which I think probably has a bearing in whether they'll put him on the stand or not later on.
If we go back to the chronology of it, we had worked really hard to try and get this interview for months and months and months. And obviously there was a nervousness about it. And at one stage, I remember this was sort of November, and they said, oh, maybe we'll just do it in the new year. And I remember thinking, if we don't do it now, it will never happen. And I said actually at the time, I wouldn't leave it till the new year, because it's an election year. It's all going to be America. It's all going to be this. Nothing will have the space. Of course, bizarrely, 2 months later, COVID happened. So really, if we hadn't done it, then I don't think it would ever have happened. And then as soon as he agreed to do it, he said, right. And I remember it was a Monday that we got told we could do it. And I said, let's just do it on Tuesday. So don't let the moment pass. And his team said, oh no, I think he needs a couple of days of preparation. And we said, okay, we understand. And it gave us more time to get hold of, the camera crews. And we didn't even have a time slot, for it to be shown at that point. I mean, it all feels quite crazy looking back, how many things we hadn't yet sort of slotted into place. And so even though I wanted to do it on Tuesday, they came back and said, oh no, I think it'll be more like Thursday. And bizarrely, in Americast speak, I was meant to be going to interview John Kelly, as in the general, John Kelly, who'd been working in the Trump administration. Yeah. And I was so excited about meeting John Kelly. And I was like, finally, I get to meet somebody from the Trump administration. There's so many questions. And I was like, oh, right, why do all the good things come at the same time? So I couldn't meet John Kelly. And I remember being sort of mortified that I had to call up and say, I'm terribly sorry, I won't be around for the John Kelly interview. And I couldn't tell them. And so, yes, we sort of trooped off to the palace on a Thursday. And I guess he had, coming back to your question in a roundabout way, those 3 days to role play. We had got a sense of what he wanted to say, and they never asked us what we were going to ask. They never told us what we could or couldn't ask. I mean, that would, clearly that would have been a showstopper for us, because we just wouldn't have wanted to do a BBC interview like that. But we did know from their end the kind of defences, if you like, that he was going to raise. And my job, and I sort of, I can't say this enough really, it wasn't to do a royal interview, and it wasn't to do a trial. It was just to do a testimony. We planned it forensically. We knew what questions we had to ask. All we wanted to do was get a record of those answers. For better or for worse, I wasn't judging. I wasn't going to decide that he was guilty or innocent. I just wanted to make sure that I had asked the questions at the time that he might later face in a trial.
Which you certainly did. There was one really extraordinary bit in it where I think you asked about a party that was thrown at Sandringham for them, and he says,
No, it was a shooting weekend.
A shooting weekend.
Just a straightforward shooting weekend.
it's a straightforward shooting weekend, and you just repeated it. You didn't arch an eyebrow, and yet everybody at home was thinking, what? Who goes on an ordinary shooting? How could you be so tone deaf to talk about, oh, no, it wasn't a party. It was just a straightforward shooting weekend, as though that is something that every Briton does every weekend. And I just thought, then the man is, seems to be tone deaf to public opinion.
I think you've put your finger on it, which is that princes do things, by definition, that normal people don't do, right? So things that do seem normal for the prince or for the royals aren't normal for most other people. So when I said it was a party and he said, no, it's a straightforward shooting weekend, he literally meant that. He thought I'd been confused. He was like, kind of 8 guns and dinner and Friday night and all the rest of it. And I don't think there was any guile in that. There was no pretense. He just thought I'd got that wrong. And the same thing when I said, there was a party that Epstein threw at his house for you. And he said,
It was a small dinner party. There were only 8 or 10 of us, I think, at the dinner. If there was a party, then I'd know nothing about that.
and I was like, that is my party. That is a party, And I said, but you were the guest of honour. And he said,
Well, I was there, so there was a dinner. I don't think it was quite as you might put it, but yeah, okay, I was there at a dinner, yeah.
and I suddenly understood the gulf between the questions I was asking and the answers he was giving, because of course, if he's at a party, he's the guest of honour. He's the prince. He's 9th in line to the throne, right? He knows the difference between a dinner and a party, because a party, probably in royal circles, has 500 people and it's in a palace, right? Whereas we're quite happy with sort of warm wine and a twiglet. So I suppose that was where it all got sort of complicated in a way, that huge gulf between his understanding of what is normal and what comes across as actually slightly outrageous.
Well, I want to bring that up to today now, because you've talked about apparently someone who prepared for the interview, yet gave answers which just created a nightmare for him, a nightmare that has not gone away. Would you put him on a stand in a courtroom in New York where he would be cross-examined? I mean, you were just trying to find out the facts, and you did it in a forensic, thorough and eye-popping way. But it's going to get a lot rougher in a courtroom. And what would you do if you were Prince Andrew's lawyers?
Yeah, I can't imagine putting him on the stand. I can't imagine him being deposed, because, depositions can come out and be made public, and they're going to be used at a trial. And those depositions, it's not like being on the stand like you see in the TV trial where it's 20 minutes over. Depositions can drag on for hours and hours. They ask the same question 10 different ways, and then they look at it and see if it all adds up. I've had friends who have been deposed. I've talked to people who have been criminally deposed. It is a grueling experience to go through. And if there are any cracks in your story, if there are any conflicts or contradictions, they're going to be hammered home by the lawyers. And these are good lawyers. They're going to be able to put him in the worst possible light. So I wouldn't be surprised if this thing, you talked about settling, this thing could still be settled at any time. And if I were Prince Andrew's lawyers, and of course I'm not even a lawyer at all, but I would want to get this thing done and dusted and out of the way as soon as possible, because the farther you get, the closer you get to trial, the more it is going to be embarrassing for him and for the royal family.
Zurch, just explain this though. Is settling in a civil suit an admission of guilt? I mean, is it like when Trump, hands down pardons to people, but to pardon somebody you have to accept their guilt? I mean, how is it seen then?
Yeah, I mean, settlements can be sealed and then you don't know at all what happened, just that the case has been dropped. There could be a stipulation that there has to be some sort of a public admission as part of the settlement, but that is, everything's on the table as far as a negotiation. I mean, this isn't a criminal trial. There's no, official finding of guilt, no criminal sentence where he could go to jail or be on parole or face other criminal penalties. This is a civil case between private parties, and so whatever the private parties agree to, that will be the way the case is disposed.
And talk us through the whole civil case thing.
I think most interestingly and importantly, as far as the difference between criminal and civil cases go, there's a difference in the burden of proof required. In a criminal case, guilt must be determined beyond a reasonable doubt. You often hear people say that in courtrooms. In a civil case, that's not the standard. The burden of proof is a preponderance of evidence, which is lower than a reasonable doubt. You can think, yeah, this probably did happen, and that's reason enough to find for the plaintiff. So it will be a lower bar for the plaintiff in this case, and a greater challenge if Prince Andrew does go to trial on this. Oh, and then there's one other kind of interesting point to make here about civil cases is that the plaintiffs who bring the cases, they have kind of a choice of venue on where to bring it. This case was brought in New York, which was obviously where Epstein was detained, was charged, and committed suicide. But there's also a law in New York, the Child Victims Act, which was passed in 2019, which lifts the statute of limitations for these kind of lawsuits so that you can bring them no matter how long ago they took place. So that's one of the reasons why this is happening in New York.
Right, well, let's bring in Randy Zelin at this point. He is a New York-based defence attorney, also adjunct professor of law at the Cornell Law School. And Randy, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I just want you to elaborate on kind of what we've just been discussing. Are we in the right ballpark about how this could or is likely to unfold?
We can start with what is immediately in front of us, which is now that Judge Kaplan has denied Prince Andrew's motion to dismiss on the basis of him having been included in the settlement, what Prince Andrew will do next is try to have the case thrown out because he will argue that Ms. Giuffre had no right to sue him in federal court in New York because she's not a resident of the United States. And he will try his hand at that. And if he succeeds there, the case is gone. And if he fails, then I think to your colleague's point, it's going to get very interesting because how will Prince Andrew hold up at a deposition? How will he hold up in responding to document requests? How will he hold up at a trial?
But Randy, are you suggesting that there are still many more falls along the way, that Virginia Giuffre might actually never see him in her trial?
Well, I think that this can unfold quite a few ways. First of all, Prince Andrew may decide, you know something, knock yourself out, chase me. Go ahead, come across the pond and chase me. I have nothing in the United States. I have no assets in the United States for you to grab onto. It's not worth my while to defend this thing. I'm damned if I do, I'm damned if I don't. So I'll default. That's certainly an option.
Wait, and default means what? You just don't show up, you don't say anything, you just what?
And she wins. But what does she win? So she wins a money judgment. Good luck collecting it. She'll have to hire law firms to go all around the world to try to enforce a domestic judgment internationally. That's certainly an option. And if it turns out that she's successful in doing that, you can always try to resolve things with her at that point. Certainly, he has the option of throwing money at her and basically taking the position, look, I'm not admitting that I've done anything wrong here, but it's going to cost me millions of dollars to defend myself. So even if I win, I lose. I'd rather give you the money and get on with my life than have to pay lawyers. And who the hell knows what's going to happen? That is the uncertainty of a trial. And that's why so few cases go to trial, because most people don't want to take the gamble when you throw your life into the hands of a bunch of strangers sitting in a jury box or to a judge. You don't know what's going to happen. I've won cases I should have lost. I've lost cases I should have won. Prince Andrew may decide, you know something? Let's just resolve things with her and let's put enough money on the table to make it worth a while. And of course, he has the option of saying, I'm pushing all my chips in and I will fight this to the death. I did not do anything wrong. I am not liable. Did not have sex with this woman willingly or unwillingly, and I am prepared to clear my name.
Randy, the thing that strikes me about what you've just said and the analysis, which I think was fascinating, is that none of these are good options for Prince Andrew. He lets it go, in which case it will look like she's won, and though she might not pick up any money, for the reputation of him as a member of the royal family, it will be catastrophic. If he offers money to settle, and even though there will be no acceptance of guilt or culpability, it will look like he is paying her off. And if it goes to trial, then there are all the risks that you've outlined. I mean, if you're a member of the British royal family, none of those options seem particularly appetising.
Well, you are right, but there is an old saying, and I think it was Walt Whitman that said it, which is sometimes you're better off thinking I'm an idiot than me opening my mouth and proving you right. So it may very well be that of all of these options, the option which is least terrible, which is least terrifying, and which is least destructive is that Prince Andrew keeps his mouth shut and he either resolves the case, and again, he resolves the case simply by saying, listen, I do not have the monarchy's backing on this. I no longer have an unlimited checkbook to pay lawyers. It's going to cost me millions of dollars to clear my name. I have to sell assets. I have to bankrupt myself. I would rather put certainty in my life and put this behind me. And I will resolve the case. And it doesn't mean that I've done anything wrong. Money is money. So whether I spend the money on lawyers or I spend the money on settling, what's the difference? The money's gone. So I would rather make a business decision.
And Randy, can I ask you about the default option? Because in that interview to me, he talked about, he sees himself as an honourable person. He said it wouldn't have been the honourable thing to do to just, call Epstein instead of going to see him. Would you call defaulting dishonourable? Is it seen as the coward's way out?
No, I would call defaulting a strategic business decision. And I'm not saying that that is the right move for Prince Andrew in this particular situation, but it's always a viable strategy. People file for bankruptcy. That doesn't mean that they're broken. It doesn't mean that they're deadbeats. They make a strategic business decision. Sometimes people default for strategic decisions where you won by default. You didn't win on the merits. You didn't win because people heard evidence or a judge heard evidence and decided you were right and I was wrong. So a default doesn't mean the same thing, and it will never be splashed about the tabloids what I said or how I behaved at a trial because I never got to a trial. And if anybody wants to bash me for it, it was a business decision. There was no reason for me to defend myself. I didn't believe that I could get a fair trial. I wasn't going to bankrupt myself and wreck my children's legacy and further tarnish the monarchy's name. So let them say whatever they want about me, but the sound of one hand clapping makes no noise. So I will not be a party to this.
Randy, we've looked at this from the end of the telescope as it relates to Prince Andrew. What about Virginia Giuffre? What if she says, I don't want to settle. I'm happy to chase him all over the world for money, whatever. Yeah,
it's an interesting question because what it always boils down to, and I get this a lot with clients, particularly when I have a criminal case with a parallel civil case, which is resolution brings certainty, it brings closure. If there's real money on the table, and remember in 2009, which wasn't all that long ago, she took $500,000. Now, you may say that's tip money for Jeffrey Epstein, but $500,000, if there was $500,000 on the floor, would you pick it up or would you step over it? So certainly for her to take this attitude of there's no amount of money I would take to settle, well then what are you doing this for? You're doing this for principle or you're doing this for money? And if you're not doing it for the money, then why'd you sue for money? So I would imagine that at some point there is a financial aspect to this. So if I'm Virginia Giuffre, there probably is a check out there that if it were written to me, okay, maybe I wouldn't be as famous and as popular as I thought I would be, and people might forget about me. But boy, I'd rather have that money in my bank account than in anyone else's bank account.
Can I ask you why you think Andrew's lawyers didn't manage to get the judge to throw it out?
That's an easy one. And I think what we need to do is we need to fly back in time. And in 2009, Prince Andrew was presented with options. There is a settlement on the table. And the issue is, Prince Andrew, do you want your name in the settlement document or not? The good news is, if your name's in the settlement document, it's truly over against you. I'm sure his response was, there's no way in God's green earth my name is going in that settlement document because that will be viewed that I did something wrong. Well, hopefully his lawyers said, well, I'm just telling you now that if your name's not in there, you are taking a gamble that one day you will say that the settlement applies to you. And the argument will be, no, it does not, because you're not named in it. And the settlement agreement says that it's not intended for any third-party beneficiaries. And you will have to rely on Virginia Giuffre and Jeffrey Epstein to come forward and say, yes, Prince Andrew was supposed to be included as a potential defendant. Now, perhaps Prince Andrew never thought that Jeffrey Epstein would be dead. I'm sure he assumed that Virginia Giuffre would never let him off the hook. But he took a gamble. And as we've now seen, fast forwarding the movie, that was a bad gamble because he actually lost everything. Not only does he not get the benefit of the settlement, but his fear that the settlement would be turned against him as some consciousness of guilt is being turned against him anyway. So he would have been better off having his name in there, getting the benefit of the settlement where it's over. He's going through the mud anyway. So he's getting all muddied and no opportunity to take a shower. So that was, in hindsight, a very poor gamble and a very poor decision that he lost.
I'm so pleased I'm not facing you, Randy, in a court. I know, I was just thinking, I definitely want you on my side because I feel like run over just listening to the way you kind of took us through that. That was quite something amazing.
It was fantastic. I was also thinking of the number of British lawyers that I've interviewed over the years. I've never had an interview with a British lawyer that was anywhere near as fun or as illuminating as that. So thank you very much for setting it out.
That's very meaningful to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Randy.
Yeah, and the problem you've now got is that you're going to be invited back on this podcast when we get an update a little bit nearer the time.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Have a good day.
So I think we should go back to the Zurcher because we haven't heard enough from the Zurcher. And give us a sense, how much is this just something that we're talking about because it is Prince Andrew? And how fascinated is the US by this potential trial?
Right. Yeah, I mean, as John mentioned at the top of the program, I mean, this is involving the royal family, and there is a bottomless appetite among many Americans for royals news. You could see it in the ratings for royal weddings. You could see it in the ratings for the TV show The Crown. We have our own celebrity culture, but we don't have a royal culture, so we just have to glom on to yours.
Borrow ours.
So I think
you could have done. I mean, that was the choice you guys made. You know, I don't want to rub it in, but you could have done. It was all going so well.
We could have kept it.
Can I just say one thing that during the 7 years that I was in America, I was asked on a number of different occasions, a variety of different events. So, do you know the Queen? And I'd say, well, you know, kind of. Not so much, and people look so disappointed.
We used to be close.
People look so disappointed, and then move on to someone else in the room who probably had something more interesting to say.
So I'm going to wear a T-shirt saying "I know the Queen." I mean, that's just the only way to get talked to in Washington,
Exactly.
right? Yeah, that's what it takes.